Well, good afternoon. Oh, come on, we can do better than that. Good afternoon. All right, thank you very much. At Planned Parenthood, we are organizers. We consider ourselves a anti-poverty fighting institution as well, so it's an honor to be here with Robin Hood today. I am delighted to have an opportunity to talk not just about kind of what I'm calling the social construction of poverty, but also the narrative construction of poverty. What are the stories that we tell that either help us lift folks out of poverty, or actually reinforce poverty? And I'm going to do it through a series of exercises around how our brains process difference, going back to work that I started 10 years ago at the Perception Institute, which is a consortium of researchers, mostly social psychologists and neuroscientists, who came together and really lift up conversations around how our brains process difference, identity differences. But before I do that, I want to tomorrow's Valentine's Day, right? Okay. So I want you to quickly picture somebody who you love. Your head. You got that? How does it make you feel? Feel good? You feel warm inside? Okay, good. Now I want you to picture a celebrity, really quick. You got somebody in your head? Okay. I had J-Lo in my head. I'm about 3 years away from 50, so I'm feeling competitive, if I want to tell you the truth. Okay, now with that muscle, I want you to picture somebody who's poor. Got them in your head? Now I'm going to ask you, were they man or woman? Are they young or old? Do they have a particular kind of race or ethnicity? Was it somebody that you knew that was completely proximate for you? Did it make you feel proximate, or did it make you feel privileged? I can guarantee you that whoever you picked, your brain picked consciously, but it was reeling through millions and millions of bits of information and stories that you've heard over time that have helped you process and understand how to understand who that person is. I want to experience our unconscious networks. That process just happened. How many triangles in the picture? How many people see more than 2 triangles? Okay, how many people see more than 3? More than 6? Okay, you got more than 6, more than 8. You have more than 8. How many do you see totally? 8? Okay, what's your name, sir?
Benji.
Benji, okay. Benji, can you tell me a definition of a triangle?
As long as it has 3 sides.
Three sides? Do they have to be enclosed?
No. Well, they have to be enclosed, but...
How many triangles do you see now? 11. There are 0 triangles in the picture. Okay, come on. This is like, kindergarten. Less than kindergarten. This is nursery school. A triangle, 3 sides, 3 angles. They have to be enclosed in order for the shape. What happened? Your brain filled in information where none existed. It filled in these gaps because I told you what to look for. I primed you. I sent you on a mission. I gave you that competition. And Benji was like, I see it. And every time I kept going up, you kept going up with me, even though there was none there. How powerful is that brain? I'm going to do one more exercise. This is a group activity. It requires you being loud and vocal. And it's called a Stroop test. Some of you may have done this before, but bear with me because it's really important. I want you to tell me what the color of the text is. Blue. Okay, together. Blue. Okay. Now I'm going to go a little bit faster to see if you can keep up. Ready? Oops, sorry. Red, green, black, green, red, okay. What happened? What happened? I mean, Wes, I got to tell you, you have a big mission to fight poverty here, and we're stumbling over colors, the color of the text. What happened? When did it get hard? Right here? Right? Because all of a sudden, the color didn't match the word, and you found out you were doing what? You were reading, even when I asked you to tell me the color of the text. but because ever since you were little, ever since you learned letters, ever since you learned that letters together form words, and inside those words is actually meaning, you came to understand that your brain just automatically wanted to read and figure out what that meaning was. I don't want you to feel bad about yourself, so we're going to try it again. Blue, red, green, black, green, black, red, green, red, blue, black, green, green, red, red, black. Give yourself a round of applause. So, the reason I made you do it again is because I want you to understand that what was happening then, right? Your brain, it felt hard, right? It felt like exhausting, emotionally exhausting, because you knew what the task was, but you still had to take that half beat and get your brain to be in concert with you. And that level of exhaustion, that level of anxiety to try to overcome how your brain has learned to process information can be really, really trying. But the fact is, while you were experiencing your automatic brain, you don't have to be at the mercy of your automatic brain. What helped? We slowed down, right? You focused, you were very intentional, you could see each word and give it its due, see each color rather and give it its due. That level of individuation, that level of being able to slow down and really understand someone's story the way Wes just so beautifully described Freddie Gray's life history, that is going to be a key for overcoming poverty. And you all at Robin Hood, you're slaying all kinds of dragons, of inefficiencies, thinking about the best evidence-driven ways of investing and creating real impact. But I'm going to argue today that one of the biggest things that the anti-poverty world has to address is how we slay the dragon of narratives around poverty. So our brains, actually just said this really quickly, our brains fill in gaps, right? What you're doing the triangles, you were filling in gaps, you were sorting information very quickly into categories and creating associations. These processes together, your brain's ability to process the almost 11 million bits of information that you process unconsciously in the same amount of time that you process things consciously, is your brain's ability to create these schemas, right? We need schemas in order to create structures to do things efficiently. I don't need to learn every day that this is a clicker. I can pick it up and I know how to press it. Because if I had to learn every day how to cross the street or what a chair was, it would be exhausting. And so our brains create these schemas in order for us just to navigate and actually build knowledge. Narratives, storytelling, stories are actually schemas too. And our brains have evolved over time to help us process information. It's actually much easier for our brains to process stories than it is to process data and facts. It just requires less semantic processing. We've grown up with kind of equations around stories. We know what a protagonist is. We know what a villain is. We know that oftentimes there's a conflict and there's a mountain to climb and there's a dragon to slay and there's some kind of resolution. And that kind of narrative arc of a story also helps us process what's real and what's not. Narratives also in our brains, we have sometimes physiological experiences with them. Have you ever watched a show and the superheroes running and they jump from building to the next building and your heart goes up because you're just imagining yourself, you're taking on the role of the protagonist. Oftentimes that happens in a narrative story too. Sometimes we'll see a story where there's someone who's going through a lot of anguish, right? I fly a lot these days and I use my story time for when I need to release and let out some emotion. I'll find a really sad story and people think on the plane who's this crazy lady crying at me? But I'm letting my brain kind of connect with the protagonist and I'm using that as an experience to kind of connect to emotion. So storytelling becomes really, really important. The stories that we tell about poverty are made up in what we call narrative schemas. And these are dominant narrative schemas. Our brains have strong schemas about things and also weak schemas. Oftentimes, the strong schemas about how we understand poverty are made up of weak schemas. And if you want to address the narratives, you kind of have to address the weak schemas as well. I'd argue that the very narratives that we use to tell about poverty, right? We just heard, that it's individuals, somebody just didn't work hard enough, they don't have the work ethic. There was no real discrimination, involved. This person just really needed to just step up, pull themselves up by their bootstrap. There is a meritocracy that people live in, so they're able to, if they're not talented, they're not going to actually win in this system. We tell a story about government, whether it should be limited government or big government, in ways that actually impact poverty. We talk a lot about individual responsibility. We moved away, I think, in large part to the culture of poverty arguments, that these things are endemic to people's cultures. And now we're talking more about they're just bad decision makers. They didn't actually get an opportunity to have that conversation. Those same stories are the stories that we also tell about wealth. Those same stories, I was able to be incredibly successful. I did it on my own, so thank me very much. I didn't need a lot of government help. I went to the best schools in my suburb that all the districts were incorporated, and we had a swimming pool. True story. We had a swimming pool. We had a golf course in a public high school. Government didn't help me, but I was able to really help myself going there. I'm clearly really, really talented, and my history doesn't matter. Yes, I'm an African-American woman, and I stand on the legacy of many African-Americans across the country, and we fought our way through slavery, and the history, the legacy of discrimination doesn't have any impact on me. So my identity, the idea that bias may still exist, doesn't apply to me, and I don't need any systemic help. So the same narratives that we use to explain wealth in many ways are the same ones that we use to explain poverty. And the challenge is that our best messages about wealth and opportunity can unintentionally reinforce messages and explanations for poverty. So how do we begin to think about disrupting these various schemas so that everyone who has the opportunity to be wealthy can move forward? Everyone who has opportunity. Everyone that we are working to support to fight poverty can move forward. Who's of Irish descent in this room? Anyone? Irish? Lots of Irish people. Okay, great. So narratives of poverty are also quite malleable. If you are of Irish descent, in the 1860s, Bridget McBruger, the woman on the left, would have been your ancestor. She would have been depicted as dehumanized. She would be uneducable. The narratives were that they were, drunk, illiterate, promiscuous, too many kids, didn't like to work. They were taking jobs away from Americans. They came over, obviously, during the Great Potato Famine. They moved into neighborhoods where there were signs like Irish need not apply to live here, Irish need not apply to work here, discriminated very, very deeply and intentionally. And yet, when we think about the Irish now, do those same characteristics and traits apply? Is anybody we're not going to get, we're not going to let Miss O'Malley give that speech after lunch because she's going to be drunk. Does anybody say that? No. Why not? When we think of the Irish, how do we think of them now? Right. We think of them as white. And how did they become white? Anyone? Because another group moved in and they became, that. It's not that they moved. Sorry. So not just President Kennedy. There are other reasons. What else? It's actually long before the political power and the Irish political machines came. What happened? Through government investment. In the 1940s, post-World War II, the government invested a huge amount of resources into backing mortgages through FHA loans, through facilitating suburbanization, through creating programs, investing in schools, and encouraging the Irish, the Italians, the Poles, and the Germans to move into neighborhoods where their loans would be guaranteed, while excluding black communities in areas that were redlined. These are maps of New York. So when we think about the impact of redlining today, it isn't just that people didn't have access, to live in certain neighborhoods. It's that access was created, wealth creation was created. My colleague who I started a perception with, her grandfather was a tool and die maker. And he put 4 kids through amazing schools, largely through the appreciation of his house over a 20-year period. So yes, jobs, having access to union labor, all of that made a marginal difference, but it was actually really an incredible transfer of wealth that allowed the Irish to become white. Now, the narratives that used to apply to the Irish, Italians, the Germans, and Poles actually are now applying to Latinx communities in the US. So this is a content analysis of, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, red is Fox, the gray is Network News, MSNBC, well, I just say it, blue is MSNBC. So the question is, how often you see these stereotypes by news source. So yeah, there's a little bit of marginal difference in terms of welfare between how much is being promoted by more conservative network than not. But by the time you get to refuse to speak English or have too many kids, which certainly they were accusing the Irish of and the Italians of, you have parity there. So thinking about kind of how the narratives have changed over time and how we use some of these same tropes to explain various groups also applies to how we think about race. So we have a wealth and poverty lens. These are actually the same boxes that you can now look at and see the same race lens. So when we ask, does race play a role in opportunity, that great question that came from the Aspen Institute from Mr. Porterfield, that becomes more apparent. Again, the same narratives that we use to explain the social determinants of health, education, of opportunity, when you overlay race on them, you can see these tropes around kind of how personal responsibility shows up, whether or not race plays a role in how your very talent is viewed. This idea that we are now, and I gather that no one here believes we actually are in a post-racial society, but the narrative that we should stop talking about race as an input into the work, you can see how that plays out. And then, of course, whether or not we should be having this conversation on an individual level or a systemic level. And the stories of poverty themselves have changed. So I'm sure many of you may recognize this image. I believe there's an exhibit going on right now it's a photo by Dorothea Lange. It's a picture called Migrant Mother. And it was taken in 1936 in a pea pickers camp in California. Lange was on assignment. She was a photographer for the Farm Security Administration. And depicting this young woman with her children in an age where a lot of young men had been sent off to war. They were fighting, and an entire social safety net sprung up in the New Deal to protect essentially mothers and soldiers. These images, these stories that were told then, were about humanizing the face of poverty, and it was about shifting the public opinion in favor of more policies to support them. In the 70s and 80s, when the face of poverty during the migration from the south to the north by many African American families came into play, the social policies changed. The layer of race, the stories about who didn't deserve to be supported were built into how we perceive race and class together. And because there are incredible stereotypes that are actually considered maybe perhaps positive stereotypes by some, the model minority stereotypes for Asian Americans, we've actually missed in many communities an increase in Asian American poverty and haven't allocated the resources to address it. So for many years, the success stories of Asian Americans throughout the country have masked the reality of many, many families that are struggling to make ends meet. So these are the schemas that I see in my work around gender. I'm going to tie the race, gender, and class together. For most women, the first thing that is noticed about us, our brain kind of categorizes identities very quickly. It goes race, gender, and age, like within a split second. For most women, gender is the first thing that people notice about us. For women of color, race trumps gender. So we see the racial body first, and all of the characteristics that are linked to the race show up in how we interact with them. So Asian women typically are seen as more passive. Latina women are seen through a more saucy, fiery lens. African American women are seen as angry because the associations related to how black men are perceived trump how their gender is perceived. It's called what we call intersectional invisibility. We can't be seen because of where we live at the intersections. So I've long argued in my involvement at Planned Parenthood that yes, there are some very fundamental ideological divides around women's reproductive health care, for sure. But there is such a powerful race lens to the work and to the arguments. And when I overlaid all of the arguments I was hearing over, I don't know, a decade of engaging with the organization onto the core dominant themes around poverty, around race, and then adding a layer of gender, you can see that each of the arguments maps on nicely. So if you really believe that we should defund reproductive health care, you might make the argument, well, you know, birth control is only $7.99 at Walmart. Anybody can get a condom. You might say, you know, we shouldn't provide Medicaid reimbursement because, you know, poor people, they've been bad decision makers. They've been, they've been out there not really able to take care of themselves. Why should it be the government's responsibility for your sex life? You might just say that that these things are for women who are already equal, right? We already have policies that support women, so why would we actually, there's no bias or discrimination that could possibly still be had. So I think about the stories that we tell, and at the disparity work, the poverty in general is often framed in terms of disparity. And the problem with the way that we use disparity, in addition to those core schemas, is that when we use data to tell stories about people, what we are actually doing is remarginalizing the group in our brains. If I tell you 1 out of 3 boys born to families of color may experience the criminal justice system at some time, our brain doesn't necessarily know how to process that because we actually technically haven't humanized not just the 2 out of 3, the 3 out of 3. We don't know if that's a big number. If I said 1 out of 3 women would get breast cancer in her lifetime, that feels really, really big because we've created the basis for humanity. So how you conquer that disparity really has to do with how we think about the aspirational frames that guide our work. So at Planned Parenthood, we just opened 50 well-being health centers inside of high schools in Los Angeles. Tale of two cities. Yes, it is actually quite amazing. It is actually quite amazing because it was a partnership between the Department of Education, the Department of Health, and an organization that has been at the front line of people's first point of entry into the healthcare system. And so now young girls can leave their calculus class and they can go and get, access to really good quality information about their bodies and contraception. They can leave feeling completely empowered. They can leave feeling a sense of agency. And in Missouri, There are creepy state health directors who are tracking young girls' menstrual cycles to figure out whether or not what's happening with their periods. They're piling on to levels of deficit, of not belonging, of harming, and of othering. And if we're going to shift our narratives around poverty, we have to think about how we cut the oxygen off of all of those weak schemas that make up the strong schemas about who deserves and who doesn't. And I urge you all to take on this work. Thank you.